Good afternoon, and thank you for joining with IHA Webinar Wednesday. Today's webinar, we have the pleasure of hearing from Casey Coy, who is currently a manager for the Cosmetics and Personal Care Program and NSF International. She also acts as the program manager for the Global Retailer Manufacturer Alliance to develop consensus-based standards in the areas of dietary supplements, cosmetics, medical devices, and over-the-counter drugs to ensure brand products are manufactured according to good manufacturing practices while meeting retailer expectations of quality and safety. Casey has a vast of knowledge in compliance and will be here to share her knowledge. And if any of you have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat box at the end of the webinar. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Casey. Casey?
Hi, Jenny. Thank you very much for having me. And I'm going to
I can't hear. I can't hear. What should I do?
Casey, can you hear us?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. We couldn't hear you before, so you might want to back up a couple slides.
Okay, I'll just start over. Sorry about that. I must have been on mute. It kind of is a little sticky button, so I unmuted and muted, and it must have remuted me. Apologize for that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Global Retailer and Manufacturers Alliance, and this alliance was formed several years ago, and I'll get into the history a little bit, but I wanted to provide a little background as to why this alliance exists, and just a little bit of background on the categories of the products that we're currently covering: over-the-counter drugs, medical devices, dietary supplements, and cosmetics. And these 4 product categories were chosen based on their level of risk to the consumer. And the retailer has actually been requiring their private label manufacturers to meet certain requirements that the regulations do hold them liable for, but actually may not be able to enforce these requirements. So the FDA is limited and based on their resource constraints, and also in the case of cosmetics, they actually do not require good manufacturing practices. So not all manufacturers and retailers have been compliant with these regulations. So as a result, the retailers reached out to third parties such as NSF to ensure these products are compliant with regulations and retailer expectations, and to develop standards to address these concerns. So I'm trying to scroll to the next slide here. There we go. A little bit of background on the GRMA and why this came about, in addition to the regulatory requirements and the retailer expectations. Manufacturers were being audited multiple times a year to meet these retailer requirements, which often resulted in a redundancy and unnecessary resource expenditures. So for private label manufacturers, as you well may know, they often will sell into multiple retailer environments, and in doing so, they often have to be audited each and every time by those individual retailers. So the other aspect of this is that the audits that the retailers were requiring by their third parties were not always consistent, and the third-party certification bodies or the third-party auditing firms were not necessarily qualifying the auditors to making sure that they were properly trained to conduct these appropriate audits. So there was quite a bit of disparity between these different audits. And the last thing I wanted to touch on was that the current audit environment doesn't really mitigate the regulatory risk of the retailer or even the financial cost of the manufacturer. So the GRMA initiative was intended to solve both of these issues to benefit both the manufacturer, these types of products, as well as the retailer to reduce their risk. So the current challenge, this is just to show you what this currently looks like, the current landscape for the auditing landscape for the retailers and their manufacturers. Each retailer uses these multiple manufacturers here at the bottom, and as you can see, the redundancy of audits adds up quickly. So the other thing to note is that the FDA often enforces these regulations on the manufacturer, but they also could hold the retailer responsible for introducing these products into commerce, because the retailer is actually, especially for their private label product, responsible for introducing these products into commerce, which by law makes them liable for any product that may not be safe or of quality. So a little history in terms of how this came about. The GRMA initiative we were first approached, NSF was first approached by major retailers to tie these requirements into an industry standard based on existing regulations, so we weren't creating any new standard requirements, or accepted global standards. So in the case of these different product categories for over-the-counter drugs, there's the regulation 21 CFR 210-211. Medical devices, there's the ISO 1345 standard. Dietary supplements has 21 CFR 111. And then cosmetics and personal care products is ISO 22716. So the intention was not to duplicate or reinvent the requirements. It's more to provide a platform by which to qualify manufacturers against these existing regulatory requirements or standards. So some of the benefits of this initiative is really ultimately to protect consumer health and safety. It allows the manufacturer to provide better risk management programs and the retailer as well, and to protect their store brand integrity. It improves the efficiency of the retailer and manufacturer interactions and allows for one single audit report per regulatory classification that would be accepted by all retailers. This then creates consistency in the audit results due to the auditor training requirements, qualification, calibration requirements that is all built into the standard, as well as reducing the number of audits by the retailers and reducing manufacturers' audit costs and time and money. All of this then allows the manufacturer and the retailer to really focus their time and spend more time on continuous improvement activities. So this is currently some of the main GRMA retailers that are participating in this initiative. There are several others. We're constantly growing this list. So if you're on the call and you don't see your name on here, you may actually be involved. But we obviously have a limited space here, so it's quite a large group of people. And these are currently the participating GRMA vendors. These are originally started out as a lot of the private label manufacturers, but in actuality, it's evolving to include branded products as well. Now, as a part of the standards development activity by ANSI, it's a transparent process to include all stakeholders. So you have the manufacturers, you have the retailers, and you also have the third-party certification bodies. So although NSF is acting as the standards developing organization and accredited by ANSI to do so, we're also an accredited certification body. So we have other certification bodies at the table as well, talking about how to develop these programs and these standards to make sure that they're achievable by both the vendor and be able to be delivered by the certification body. We also have several other participating stakeholders. We have UNPA, American Chemistry Council, Consumer Healthcare Products Association, APA, Council for Responsible Nutrition, ICMAD, and PCPC. Now these trade associations are specifically covering the product categories that the GRMA is currently addressing. However, we do expect this to evolve and expand as the GRMA addresses different product categories as well. I wanted to provide a little background on the ANSI standard development process, just really brief, because this is unique. And the reason being is that there are a lot of independent third-party programs out there, but in order to really achieve an industry-accepted standard, you really need to follow the ANSI standard development process. And ANSI is the American National Standards Institute. It's a private, nonprofit organization that administers and coordinates the U.S. voluntary standardization and conformity assessment systems in the private sector. So what does that mean? That means that ANSI is the designated body in the U.S. to create voluntary standards based on a consensus process. They act as the ISO member body for the United States, as well as provide accreditation to SDOs and third-party certification bodies. The process review for voluntary standards development is required to verify the openness as well as ensure due process. So it's really key that as a part of the ANSI standard development process that any person that has direct or material interest in the standards development or standard being developed has a right to participate by expressing their position and basis, having the position considered, and having the right to appeal. So it's not a unanimous voting process, but it does allow each and everybody who has an interest in these products, categories, or these standards to have a voice. Now this is just to show you the benchmarks for the ANSI standard development process to make sure that it is a truly consensus process. There must be evidence of consensus, there's openness, coordination and harmonization of activities, lack of dominance of any one group or party, balance of interests across the stakeholder group, as well as notification of standard activities. It's required that standards being developed are publicly available and there's availability for public comment, as well as consideration of views and objections. So because the GRMA is broader than just one standard being developed, there's 4 standards being developed, there was a need to create a governance board because the activities are evolving, there's additional standards that are going to be developed. And really the purpose was to provide some oversight of this initiative. So a governance board was developed to provide this oversight as well as to define the ultimate mission and goals, prioritize future activities in standards development, as well as drive further independence from NSF. Although NSF was requested to be the standards developing organization, and I was driven with the activity of moving this forward, it really needs to become more of an autonomous entity, which the GRMA Governance Board is moving it towards. We're going to also be developing a website and be working on content for that website and implementing management governance of the GRMA standards. So what we did is we selected 4 retailers and 4 manufacturers currently based on their engagement level in the standards development activity, as well as their cross-section of cutting across the multiple product categories. So we wanted to make sure that we included vendors that may be manufacturing multiple product categories, as well as not only in the U.S. but also globally. And these are the 4 retailers that were selected: Costco, H-E-B, Walgreens, and Wegmans, and then these 4 manufacturers: First Quality, Perigo, UEC, and Vijon, These are all private label focused manufacturers that sell into multiple retailers and are having to meet, demand. Their audit demand is quite high. So what's come out of these meetings so far? The governance board activity, we really wanted to pin down our vision and mission and goals. So I'm just going to go through these for you to kind of identify that this group is currently focused on these 4 product categories, but it very much could expand to include other product categories as well that the IHA covers. So the vision really is to build quality standards together because it is a consensus-based process, and the intention is to improve the quality and safety of these products for consumers. It really ultimately does ensure that we actually do work together. The mission is really to deliver consumer confidence by continually advancing quality standards for the global market. Now we have core values that we wanted to make sure that we put out there to ensure that all the stakeholders uphold these as we move forward with all standards development activity. It's very important to maintain integrity and transparency in this process, as well as inclusivity. We want to make sure that all the voices are heard, no matter how much they may be against or for this initiative. That we really want to make sure that they're involved in this, as well as it's focusing on quality and being acting as a united group. Now these are some goals which could change throughout in the future, but right now these are the core focus goals. We want to strengthen product quality, product safety, and consumer trust throughout the supply chain. So as I mentioned, the GRMA is covering these 4 product categories. They also are going to be covering aspects of the supply chain as well. So we will be going up the supply chain to cover ingredients, as well as down the supply chain to cover packaging, labeling, warehouse, and distribution. So another goal is to develop consensus-based quality standards through an open and inclusive process that engages all stakeholders involved. Ultimately, we want to create single standard certification that will help reduce audits and costs while improving efficiencies, and to design a blueprint to create future standardized requirements for each product category focused on consistency, integrity, compliance, and quality practices. Now the governance board debated and deliberated a lot on this language, and a lot of these words were really intended to make sure that we're consistent with our messaging, and that we hold some of these core values to be on top of mind moving forward with all activity. Now some of you may be familiar with the Global Food Safety Initiative. This is otherwise known as GFSI. This initiative took about 10 years to develop, so it really did take a long time. But there's there are a lot of parallels that I wanted to cover with GFSI and GRMA, as well as some differences to highlight. So both initiatives really do address the redundancy of vendor and supply chain audits required by retailers. Both initiatives strongly were supported and are supported by industry stakeholders, as well as both do allow the supply chain to focus on quality systems improvement versus just accommodating audits. If you can imagine a manufacturer who is accommodating an audit once or twice a month versus being able to accommodate maybe once or twice a year, the amount of time that they save and the ability to focus on improving their quality management systems and practices, training their personnel, it really does allow them to put their energy and focus in the right places. And some of the major differences really, clearly the GFSI is focused on the food industry. GFSI was also initially led by industry, so there wasn't a group or an SDO or a CB that was involved to develop this. It was really the industry that came together on its own, and then eventually had it administered by the Consumers Good Forum, which is a membership-based organization. GFSI also does accept multiple benchmarked audit schemes. So at this point in time, there were many industry standards. There were many already accepted schemes that were developed by standards development organizations. So instead of actually recreating standards, they benchmarked them, which allowed multiple standards to be accepted by these retailers. So the GRMA covers 4 industries while the GFSI covers 1, and the GRMA standards are intended to develop one standard based on one auditing scheme for each of the 4 product classifications. I'm going to provide a little bit of background and history. NSF was reached out to by some major retailers in 2014, and we pulled them together as well as brought in some industry manufacturer representatives and manufacturers to hold a concept meeting to understand exactly whether or not this is something that really the industry would get behind, and how would would this look like. So we had a follow-up meeting at NSF in July, and we developed working groups for each category. We also pulled in many more manufacturers to get their involvement and to really understand whether or not they felt that this would be a beneficial initiative. Everybody was very supportive, so we decided to move forward with filing our project initiation notifications, or PINs. These are necessary to file with ANSI to develop GMP, or not GMP, but any standard following the ANSI standard process. And the intention of that is to prevent any duplication or of efforts. So we filed these 4 PINs for dietary supplements, OTC drugs, cosmetics, and medical devices. Now, a little background on the medical devices. There actually was already an ANSI standard that was developed for medical devices, and it's based off of 1345. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to be adopting that standard by the GRMA and building out any harmonization requirements that the other standards will require for the GRMA oversight. So then in 2015, we wanted to educate the stakeholders on the ANSI standards development process because it can be very confusing, a lot of terminology and language that people aren't familiar with. So we hosted this in January of last year, and that is available and recorded for people that are on the call today that would like to learn more, and I'm happy to send that out. And then we developed working groups, and we wanted to start this process because joint committees are required to actually vote on standards language, but the working group is a pre-joint committee phase that allows us to actually begin to meet as well as develop some language instead of starting from scratch once the joint committee is officially formed. Task groups were also created, which would be subgroups to those working groups, to focus on specific aspects of the standard. So we started one on grading and scoring, and what would that look like? How would facility be qualified against these requirements? As well as held several meetings throughout the spring and summer, and we were able to identify a chair for the Joint Committee in 2015 for dietary supplements and submitted applications, and then also identified chairs for the cosmetics and OTC groups. So we did host our first summit meeting last year on August 3rd and 4th, and we were able to seat the Joint Committee for Dietary Supplements in September of last year. We held our first Joint Committee meeting, which is a Joint Committee is actually a balanced representation, so you have to have a balanced group of stakeholders. You have to have a significant number of manufacturers or industry. You have to have a balanced group of retailers or users or certification bodies, and then there's also a third stakeholder group that's called the public health group, and that's academia, regulatory, military, public health organizations. So that's kind of the challenging group to fill, but in order for us to move forward with seating the Joint Committee and voting on the language in the standard, you have to have that Joint Committee group formed and balanced. So in the meantime, we did form task groups to talk about some of these aspects, such as what would the audit scope and duration be, the process by which you certify against these standards, the audit criteria interpretation, so that would be the requirements. In the case of dietary supplements, it's 21 CFR 111. How do you interpret against those requirements is also key. So in order to make sure each certification body is actually evaluating these facilities consistently, you want to make sure that they're interpreting what those requirements are and how a facility would meet those requirements. So this year we had quite a bit of activity, and I can count that from last August to this August there were about 70 external meetings just on GRMA. So that's joint committee meetings, working group meetings, and task group meetings. So we've really actively been meeting all remotely to get the standard language developed. Now we've also had to ensure that we harmonize. So each group is developing their own language, but the retailers really want to see these standards be consistent in terminology, in form, and in function. So we've actually been having to pull the groups back together to harmonize to make sure that we're not deviating from each of the other groups as well. And then finally we really needed to provide a piece of the standard that covers auditor competency and certification body oversight. So ANSI does provide oversight for the accreditation of these certification bodies, but it can be limited, and so the GRMA itself wanted to also provide some additional oversight. So we're building that language into this standard as well, and that's in progress. And the drafts are currently being reviewed for each task group section of the standard. The dietary supplement group also needed to focus a little bit on FSMA, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act. There were some aspects in that regulation that were going to be required for dietary supplements. So we made sure that we included those in the language as well for the requirements section. So these are just some of the goals, and I'm focusing on dietary supplements right now because the Joint Committee is seated and they'll be the first one to actually finish the standard. But we really wanted to wanted to make sure the Joint Committee began reviewing the audit requirements as well as the audit criteria to make sure that they're comfortable with the language that the task group has developed before they receive the final draft standard to vote on. So as the other task groups are meeting to finalize some of this language, the Joint Committee will be reviewing some of the aspects that have already been developed and performing straw ballots, voting on straw ballots to hash out any issues that they may have prior to the final balloting. The ultimate goal would be to have draft language and approval by the Joint Committee by the end of this year. And once the Joint Committee agrees on the language, then it goes through a review by the Council of Public Health Consultants, which is an external panel that the NSF uses for all standards development. And then it eventually goes into public comment. So with that timeline being laid out, a best case scenario goal of finishing and publishing the dietary supplement standard by the end of Q1 next year. So that's all I have on the GRMA, and I did dig a little bit into the dietary supplement standards, but we're also moving forward with the other three. And as I mentioned, the Governance Board will start to begin to prioritize additional activity and focus as it pertains to other product categories that they sell in their stores. So now I'd like to open it up and give it back to Ginny to ask any questions or open it up to the group for any questions that you may have.
Okay, Casey, we do have a few questions. Is the FDA aware of the GRMA, and what are their thoughts on the alliance?
Yeah, so the FDA is involved. They're actually a voting member. They've applied to be a voting member for the cosmetic group. So the FDA has multiple branches. There's the Office of Colors and Cosmetics. There's the CIFSAN, which covers dietary supplements. And then there's the CEDAR, which covers OTC drugs. So we have different levels of engagement depending on which group we're talking about. They are aware of it from a CEDAR perspective for the OTC drug one, as well as the dietary supplement one, but they're currently not actively involved in the standards development process.
Okay. How will end consumers know about the alliance and what it means for product safety and quality?
Well, we're working on developing separate website on the GRMA that would educate industry and people interested as well as consumers. The consumer will not necessarily see a mark on the product itself. A certification mark would be more in the website, in the literature, demonstrating that a facility meets the standard for good manufacturing practices. But in order to educate the consumer on what GMP is and communicate what these standards involve, it can be a challenging task. So we're looking at the GRMA entity to provide more consumer outreach, just as the GFSI initiative has done so for food safety.
What are the challenges to developing one standard and one audit scheme that can be applied across the board product category for whether it's housewares, dietary supplements, just across the board for all products?
Well, we're really not developing one standard for all product categories. It's one standard per product category. But the real challenge is the harmonization of those standards. So, you know, you don't want to hold super strict requirements that would be in a drug GMP environment on cosmetics or on, let's say, houseware or something that's not as high of a risk. But you want to make sure that the manufacturers and the retailers are on the same page when it comes to semantics and to language and to how these facilities are qualified against these standards. So even though the requirements within the standard may be different and slightly different for each product category based on risk, the actual overall structure, function, and form of the standards needs to be consistent, and that's can be quite a challenge as you're going through this process.
Okay, great. Another one, what have you heard from retailers specifically about what they're looking for or what concerns they've had with respect to current supplement standards and goods?
Sure, yeah, so really the challenge is that there's confusion out there. So the current landscape is when you have multiple auditing schemes or multiple standards, the question is, how are they different? Well, nobody, of course, each group that's developed those individual standards is going to say theirs is the best. But if it hasn't gone through a consensus-based process, there really is no transparency and understanding. So the retailers had some concerns as to whether the existing landscape and the existing programs met their requirements and actually whether they were being upheld appropriately as well. So this provides that ultimate level of oversight that they can count on and rely on that the standards are being followed appropriately.
Okay, what efforts might need to take place to ensure auditors are properly trained and accountable to the standards set through this initiative?
Yeah, so the GRMA is actually considering becoming a membership-based group that would fund some activity, and one of those things would maybe the overall training of the auditors. Right now it's up to each certification body to appropriately qualify, train, and calibrate their auditors, and the standard will spell out those specific requirements as well. So the certification body will be required to do so, but the GRMA entity as a whole has considered, okay, maybe we should have a central place to or platform for qualifying and training these auditors instead of relying on each certification body to do it themselves.
Okay, great. I think one last question I'm showing. Ultimately, this effort is about ensuring quality and safety of products. How can people get involved? And what are you looking for from the industry at large right now?
Well, we're really performing a lot of reach out to all industry stakeholders to get them involved. It makes it more challenging you know, to go through the consensus-based process. But the more people we have involved, the more widely accepted these standards will be. So for anybody that would like to become involved, you can become involved as an observer on the GRMA as a whole. You can become more specifically focused on a product category, or even become involved in the actual standards development language in the task group, at the task group level. So if you're interested, you just need to reach out to myself or Rachel Brooker. She's the Standards Development Liaison with NSF, and that's information is on the slide in front of you. And if you have any questions or would like to explore other aspects of this, please feel free to reach out and give me a call.
Well, great, Casey. I believe that is it. On behalf of IHA, I'd like to thank you and NSF for your time and your knowledge and sharing this webinar. And for those of you who would like to refer back to it, this will be on www.housewares.org, and you will see the icon for webinars. And you feel free to share it with your staff or whomever. And once again, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Casey, and have a great day.
Thank you, Jenny, for having me. Have a great day.
Thank you.